Okay, so here's the basic idea. Um, so just imagine a field here. Okay, end zone up there. As usual, uh, offense is going this way, so they're trying to score in that end zone down there. And imagine the thrower here. Okay, and then a receiver downfield. So what we're going to basically do is look at the threats that an offensive player would have, and then see how to basically break down and eliminate those threats in order to create like a defense around them. All right. So if you think about just some offensive player, I would basically say that they have three threats. Okay, three threats, and I'll draw them like this. So why do I say three and not, I don't know, 7 or whatever? Like have threats going over here and over there, whatever. The reason is that a lot of these threats are kind of equivalent. Okay, so I guess starting with the deep ones, basically all these deep threats. The reason why I say they're kind of equivalent is that if you throw the disc deep, a defender, like if a defender is defending a deep threat, they can probably get to any of those more or less. Like if you're positioned, if we have a defender that's say positioned deeper of the offensive player, then any throw that goes up deep, they can probably defend those. So you can just represent that as one threat. For the ones going to the side, like say this one over here, this guy right here, that threat I'm going to say is basically equivalent to that threat, because I think this is just the better one, right? Because if you imagine someone cutting like out to the side and they have a defender here, the defender can take the shorter path. So the disc goes out into this space. The defender can take the shorter path and block the disc, right? So you don't really want to cut out horizontally. It's just going to be less efficient than cutting toward the disc. Cutting to us again. You're cutting to the space, but cutting toward a space that's more in rather than sideways. So sideways threats really aren't that viable. You might as well cut in at an angle. And then I think kind of the funniest one to consider is maybe the threat of going straight under. And I think the reason why that also isn't viable is because when you consider the mark, how the mark might be positioned, again, the mark, the defender on the frisbee, we haven't talked about exactly where they would be yet, but probably the place they're not going to be is like right behind the disc, right? If the mark is right behind the disc, then yeah, you kind of see throwing the disc straight forward, but that's probably the worst place for the mark to be, unless in some very special circumstance. So it's the mark is probably either going to be, completely on top, flat, in which case, okay, that's not really a viable threat anymore, or it's going to be biased to one side or the other, at least a little bit, and wherever that bias is, like if the mark is biased kind of this side, then you can say, well, if the threat is just straight down the middle, then the mark's going to influence that throw. So again, might as well kind of go out. Oops, it's supposed to be an arrow. Go out over there. So that's my reasoning for kind of saying that in general we can think about an offensive player in the middle of the field like this having three threats. Yeah, the stall 9 mark, someone said. Yeah. So like there may be some very specific circumstance where you want to, go completely behind the thrower to take something, to take a threat away. Like if it's stall 9, you only have 1 second left, you pull out all the stops and just go crazy. But generally that's not going to happen. So this picture here where the offensive player has threats kind of in all directions, I think that's kind of like what happens in a in like a pickup game right? That like a very unstructured pickup game. You go to a pickup game where people are like, we don't like all those fancy rules. We just kind of play, we don't do forcing or any of that stuff. This is basically what you get, right? You have the offensive player being able to, at any time to really go to three different major places on the field. And one of the fundamental ideas I wrote up in the last stream was the idea that an offensive player needs more than one threat to succeed, and here they are, right? They have three, so they're going to succeed. And this, like, personally, this is why I don't like playing those kinds of games. I mean, it's fun to run around and play frisbee, but like defensively, I feel like the deck is stacked against me, right? That the offensive player can go three different directions. I could do an outstanding job and shut down two of them, take away two of them, and yet they could still get the disc. And I feel, I spent all that effort and we're still getting beat somewhere. But I think beyond that, like once you move to kind of more structured ultimate, I think this is a good way to think about kind of making an impact defensively. By the way, there's like this, someone's doing like construction outside. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but it's distracting to me. I don't know if you guys hear it. Anyway, so basically what I'm saying is like if you've been in a game where it feels like good, you can only hear me, great. If it feels like you're getting beat in all places, right? Like, they're beating us to every side of the field. They're beating us deep. They're beating us under to both sides of the field. It's like a really disheartening place to be in it, and it's like you feel like you can't even problem solve there, right? So it's not even that you're not doing well or preventing scores. It's like you don't even know where to start because there's just no structure. So basically what I'm going to try to convince you of here is that you need to add some structured thinking, if at all possible, to reduce the number of possible threats so you can have a chance. And then once you know what you're shooting for, then you can problem solve. Doesn't mean you're going to solve all the problems, but at least you can go into like a huddle in a game with some ideas, right? Rather than, oh man, we're just getting beat everywhere. Okay, so we have three threats here, and let's start eliminating them, right? Let's create a defense where we don't have so many available threats. So the easiest place to start, I think, is let's say the defender. The defender is a good place to start because obviously we have someone downfield on a match defense. We can defend one of these threats generally. As a defender, generally, it's not too hard to take away one of them. If I said, hey, go out and defend this person and make sure they don't cut deep. Well, you can position yourself deep, and you can make sure that that if any throw goes deep, you're going to start deeper than them, and you're going to take that away. Or you could say, well, stop in cuts over to this side. Stop in cuts over to this side. So again, now you're kind of taking away this threat here. So that's only one of them, right? So we still have other threats. But before we kind of allocate that person, before we tell them where to go, let's start with the mark, because we have the mark, right? We have someone whose sole job is to stand next to the thrower and, let's say, prevent throws somewhere. Like I think we get to more structured ultimate just by saying take away some specific threat, right? Again, if you go to some pretty unstructured pickup game, then the marks there, they don't really have any specific objective, right? They kind of, you run all around the other person, you're waving your arms like crazy, but you're not trying to stop anything specific. And so you can't really game plan around that, right? Like downfield, the defender doesn't know which of these three threats are going to be taken away, and so they don't know which ones are left to them. And then you end up with inconsistent defense, right? That other thing I mentioned. So like say the mark is marking over here. They're taking away this threat, but the defender didn't game plan with them. They don't know that they're going to take away the threat. So maybe the defender is also over here defending against this threat. And then we have two more threats left open. Right, so again, that principle of needing consistency in defense. Okay, so if the mark is going to take away a specific threat, I think there's ways for them to move to take away each of the threats we have here, right? So this mark here, like I said, would take away that threat to this, I guess the left side of the field. They could also bias the other way, right? So they could be on this side and take away this threat. And then the other thing I think they can generally do is they can go flat, right? In this case, throws will be difficult. Like we're taking away the deep threat. And I think there's a little bit of nuance here, because when the mark is positioned, there's generally like a sort of a radius of a circle that they're going to take away. So from this mark, maybe you're taking away throws in this area. Okay, like you're not really stopping a throw over here, although you may affect it. And honestly, it's possible that you like allow a throw up here as well. It's just way less probable, right? And it depends on the skill of the mark relative to the skill of the thrower. But as far as game planning purposes goes and thinking about strategy, you can say like a flat mark would take away like roughly this chunk of the field. And again, it's a place to start with problem solving, because if you have the mark set up this way and then a throw is allowed up through the middle of the field, again, you can't say this will never happen. But if it does, that's something that you can talk about, right? You can say, well, we set up our strategy to not allow throws up the middle of the field, and then they happened. Well, like, is what's wrong with our marks? Is it just something we can't do because of the strength of the throwers? We need to change our strategy, or do we just we need to get more energy? Our marks need more energy, or we need to do more skill training or whatever. But it's a place to think structurally about what's happening in the field. Again, like if you have that flat mark, it's harder to throw deep, not impossible, but we can say that we kind of take away that threat. And then also, as we've seen, we could bias the mark left and right to take away the one side of the field. And this is like, this is kind of abstract, right? In a real game, you can get more nuanced. How, is it completely flat mark, or is it, a little biased to one side? Is it, if it is on one side, is it really on one side, or is it a little more flat? There's a lot of nuance there, but I think this is a good way to just start thinking about it. Okay, so with the idea that there are three threats, what we want to try to do on defense is subtract them till we get to zero, right? Eliminate all the threats. So a very simple scheme that is very common, is to have a mark that's biased on one side, right? And now we can say, okay, we've eliminated that threat. And now we have a defender, right? So we can eliminate one more. And is there a way that we can actually get to zero? Okay, so there's two threats left. And I think basically the idea here is that if you allocate your defender in a way that they have a chance at covering both, then you're leaving a lot up to chance. I mean, you're leaving a lot up to the relative skill levels of the cutter and defender, which is, it's fine. But sometimes you can do better, is what I'm saying. So basically here there's two threats, and we have a defender and say, okay, kind of do your best at defending both. Try to challenge either one. Probably a lot of times you're not going to be able to do that. But do your best. And maybe that's all you can do. But there are situations where you can do better. All right. So what's a situation where you can do better? You can get to zero. You can get to zero threats if you have help from other factors in the game. Okay, let's say the thrower doesn't have good deep throws. If the cutter is infinitely far from the disc. Okay, yeah. So I'll get to that. I'll do that one next. Let's start with the idea that the thrower just isn't a good thrower. Like they don't have deep throws. That's something that you can game plan around, right? Because if they can't throw deep, they've kind of self-eliminated that threat. And so the defender now only needs to worry about that under threat. Okay. And they take that away. And then you're good. You've gotten rid of all the threats. And again, that this doesn't mean that they will literally not be able to complete a pass. You probably can't go that far. But you can see that their offense wouldn't function that well. It's possible that the cutter, would be able to cut in and get it. Maybe they're able to run past the defender, whatever. That'll happen. But you can see that this isn't. It's not a good situation with the offense to be in. And a game of Ultimate isn't played on one throw or one point. There's something like 30 points in a game, right? If you play to 15, you might play 30 points in a game. And to score, you're probably going to need, probably an average like three or four throws at least to score in any given possession. Basically, like if you have a functional offense, then you're going to generate scores, and if you don't, then you won't. So if the defense is able to create the situation a lot, then they'll succeed. So yeah, if you play against a team that doesn't have deep throws, you can solve that problem. Or if you can recognize quick enough that, a particular thrower doesn't have deep throws, you can also solve that problem, right? If you're able to adapt quickly enough. Just an idea. All right, so someone in chat mentioned if the cutter is infinitely far from the disc. I don't know if that was a joke or not, but I'm going to treat it like a serious scenario. But basically imagining when the cutter is actually, say, very infinitely far. I'll say like very far down the field, right? They're basically in the end zone. This is kind of similar to a situation we saw last time. But basically, yeah, the cutter has fewer threats now. You would say the deep throw is no longer viable, right? The space is spoiled because of the person there, whether it's offense or defense. We talked about that last time. So without that threat, now there's only this one, and the mark is taking this one away. So then you're ending up with one, and then the cutter can be positioned to take the last one away, right? That's kind of how that goes. All right. Another situation, let's say the thrower's a good thrower. Maybe the cutter isn't very good, right? The cutter is not a deep threat because why? Well, maybe they've shown throughout the game that they don't have any interest in cutting deep. This happens, right? Especially, I think, kind of at lower levels. But as an offensive player, you need to be able to make all these cuts in order, right? You need to have multiple threats in order to succeed. And if a cutter hasn't developed all the parts of their game, if they only feel comfortable cutting in and not deep, then if you can sniff that out as a defender or as a coach, right, coaching a team against a team that has cutters that aren't going to cut deep, then that's something that you game plan around. say, oh, they can't cut deep. That threat isn't there. We use the mark to take away one. The defender takes away the other. Boom, we're done. And this sounds like really simple, but I think it doesn't always happen. This simple adjustment doesn't often happen, right? Because you have to recognize that a threat doesn't exist. And the moment that a threat isn't there, and you recognize that, you have to pounce on it. You have to use that to your advantage. So yeah, so maybe the cutter, I don't know, like you're out defending a cutter and you think, oh, like I can beat this person in the air, or, you know, I feel like I'm fast enough to catch up. Then you might, as a defender, you know, you say, well, I can, it's not that the threat isn't there, but I can sort of really bias myself under to take away this threat. And then if they do go deep, you know, it'll probably work in my favor most of the time. That's something you can do. All right. Another situation is wind, right? So if it's a super windy day and the wind is blowing this direction into the thrower, right? Then again, even if the thrower on a normal day has pretty good deep throws, today they don't because the wind is so strong. So that's also a situation where, you know, the deep threat is solved for you, and you have to recognize that, and then make sure that you're game planning appropriately so that you are biasing your defenders to stopping undercuts. All right. So another one that comes up is another fundamental from last time. Spoiled spaces, right? If a space is spoiled, then it's no longer a threat. We talked about that, right? So let's say a teammate of the offense has cut deep, and they're hanging out deep, right? They're in the end zone, and they're saying, "Hey, throw it to me. You know, I'm open." They're not really open, right? The defender's right there. This space is now spoiled. Okay, so this cut is no longer a threat. And again, the mark takes away this. And again, you can rely on the defender to defend that last cut. And then we solved it. We got down to 0 threats. But it's not just the deep space that could be spoiled. There could also be maybe some other cutter, like cut over here for whatever reason. And again, now here's the defender for some reason. And okay, now this thread is no longer viable. This one's hanging away by the mark. And now the defender should actually bias deep to take away the final deep threat. Right? Because this cutter over here spoiled this whole space. So this is the kind of problem solving that it kind of needs to happen. Some of the stuff needs to happen in real time. The wind, maybe not so much, right? You can call a timeout before the game and say, hey, look, recognize how the wind is blowing. Like, we should adjust our defense accordingly. But in the course of gameplay like this, you probably need to recognize this in real time. I mean, again, you can call it timeout and say, hey, look what their offense is doing. They are habitually, spoiling that space over here, and yet at the same time we're getting BT, right? So their in cuts are actually not viable because of something happening in their offensive strategy. But at the same time, our defenders are recognizing that their deep cuts are viable. We're not recognizing that. And so even though there's this kind of glaring weakness in their offensive strategy, we're still letting them score by giving them threats that we should take away. Right, here's another instance. Let's say we're going to move the disk a little bit. Okay, I'm going to move the disk over to this side of the field. And again, we have our 3 threats. In this situation, we may be getting some help from the sideline. I'm gonna take the wind away because we're not really considering that anymore. So here, it's not a threat for the cutter to like literally cut out of bounds, right? If you receive the disc out of bounds, it's turnover. So that's not a threat. So in the interest of defensive consistency, it would not make sense to have a mark at this angle, right? Again, you have a mark here and kind of draw this like kind of cone of defense. In this case, the cone of defense is pointed squarely out of bounds. So again, that's not consistent. We're defending, like this space is being defended by 2 things, the sideline and the mark. So that threat is being taken away by 2 different sources, 2 different actors. So we shouldn't do that. So a consistent mark here, you might just want to go flat in this case, right? Now you know like they could throw the disc a little, like curve it out and in, so you can't. It's not like the sideline's a wall, right? It's just a line on the ground. But you can still adjust your mark so that your kind of cone of defense is kind of more like this, right? And so then this threat is taken away by the mark. And I would say even it's very possible that this deep threat is also taken away by the mark. Like with a flat mark, again, I don't know about the angles I drew exactly, but like you can imagine in a flat mark, if done aggressively, like you just have to take away a little bit more of an angle to actually cover a large part of the field in the deep space. Oh my god, I got a spammer. I don't know how to get rid of them. So basically, even in this case, we can say that there's now only one real threat, right? It's and so the defender again can position themselves in a way to defend that last threat. So this is basically a very long-winded way of saying that you don't want to get stuck on the sideline. That if you're on the sideline, there's probably a way for the defense to set up and make your offense operate a lot worse. You probably already do that intuitively if you played the game before. You know, it's like, oh, get off the sideline, don't get trapped on the sideline, all that stuff. But this is, I think, the principle behind it, where a lot of the threats sort of disappear, and then the defenders can take away the last available ones. And again, you can solve it down to 0. Not just one threat, but 0 threats. All right. I think there's another case I want to cover. I think, this probably goes on, but one more, I think, pretty important one to cover. So we haven't talked about this at all, but typically in Ultimate Frisbee offense, you'll set some players downfield. There'll be receivers, cutters, they can be called, right? And then you have some players closer to the disc, handlers, kind of like your quarterbacks in football. So without getting too much detail into that, it often happens that, you can sort of misposition one of these handlers. So you have this person, again, near to the disc to help them, say, reset the stall count or remove the disc around, things like that. But if they're positioned sort of in a way such that they plus their defender are spoiling this space, then again, this cut is not viable. And then we only have the deep cut and the cut on this side to worry about. And if you position the mark, say flat, that can take away the deep cut. There's only one left. Again, the defender just defends that. And then you're good. So again, this is another case where you'd want to recognize the moment-to-moment configuration of the players on the field. If a handler's defender is spoiling a space on the side, then that can adjust how the mark is positioned, which can adjust how the defenders downfield are positioned, and then basically take away all the threats, you get to 0. Okay, a lot of stuff there. I think I'll pause for a minute and take questions. Basically, for the rest of this, I was just planning on just talking about terminology a little bit, and then maybe some other kind of defensive schemes, but not doing a lot more today. So if you have questions, throw them out there. How would you recommend a defender execute this? Like, when should they look at the mark? Good question. Sorry, just to restate it. So the idea that the defender downfield is adjusting to the change in circumstances and choosing whether, say, to defend the deep threat or the under threat, depending on the change in circumstances. And they say, it seems like there's a lot to watch. The spaces that could be spoiled, your mark, your defender's hips. Yeah, there is a lot. And that's definitely something that makes the game interesting, right? If this wasn't if this wasn't difficult, if this were easy to do, then there wouldn't be such a large difference in skill levels. And, you would get good at the game in a year instead of 5 years, 10 years. Like really good deep games are difficult, and they're worth the things that people invest their entire lives in understanding better and playing better. But I'm not saying it's like you can't get to this level. I think you definitely can. So one thing to start off with is that a team strategy will really help you. Right, so you're not just coming in there blind, like, I'm this one defender and I have to solve the entire my entire opponent's offensive game plan by myself. No, like you've gotten instructions probably in your huddle where you've all agreed to say, hey, well, let's first of all, I get to do some terminology kind of on the fly. First of all, like, let's always bias our marks on this side to force the throws to kind of this side of the field. So as a defender, you already have more information about what is generally going to happen. So again, the terminology here, this will be a force defense. I left an open quote because I'll fill it in a second. But basically, so this is a force where a person throws this side of the field. So as a defender, already kind of what's likely to happen. And then for the other things you mentioned, like, okay, spoiling spaces, and things like that, to your defender's hips, you'll get better at basically taking in information, right? You'll, like, instead of just watching the person you're defending, you'll quickly, look back and take some information about where the disc is on the field, where how the mark is exactly positioned, things like that. You'll be able to kind of more subconsciously think about the wind and not have to, like, intellectually think about it so much if you've played for longer. But yeah, I think a lot of it is just like getting better at taking quick looks you hear like an up call, right? Like the thrower throws the disc, so the whole offense repositions. Like the disc is thrown from here, maybe over to the sideline. And then when you hear someone yell up, right? Like the disc is in the air, one of your fellow defenders or sideline teammates gave you the information. You can glance over, you can see that the disc repositioned, you can see that, okay, there's now a marked foot, in this position. And then now I can reposition myself downfield because I kind of know how that stuff works. And again, it takes repetition. This stuff is way too hard to think in, to completely think through on the fly as if you're doing it for the first time. But with reps, it'll become more natural. And you can do it more instinctively and kind of focus more on the effort side of things and not have to think so intellectually every time the disc moves. Tell me if I didn't answer your question or if you have follow-up. All right, a little more terminology. When you call out a force, you don't just say, well, this is a force defense, because, okay, what direction are you forcing, right? So you have to be a little clear about that. So different ways to call it out, if there's a nice, lovely river that runs alongside your frisbee field, that would be nice. You say force river, right? Force the throws to go toward the river. Like that's like an easy way to communicate which side you're going to bias the mark on, right? Or if there's a really resplendent bird, peacock, that wandered onto the field, you force toward the peacock or whatever. It's not typically what happens, right? Typically you just say, well, if all your teammates are on this sideline, this is where, you threw your stuff in a big clump of stuff when you walked onto the field. You could say force home, right? Force home. Because that's the side of the field with all your stuff. That's like home. And then force away would mean the other side. Right, this would be the away side of the field. But honestly, usually, well, it's probably a cultural thing, but usually you say force forehand or force backhand. So this is classically like a forehand force, because you can imagine if the thrower, oops, I should have drawn a star. Stars are throwers. If you can imagine the thrower is right-handed, which I think 90% of people are, then a right-handed player would have their forehand coming out. I wonder if the video is mirrored. It's kind of weird. But basically, a right-handed player, the forehand throw would come out to this side of the field. Right, so this is a force forehand. You're forcing throws to the forehand side. If you called force backhand, that would imply something like that, where the throws are being forced to the backhand side of the field. And obviously lefties, you have to remember that even if I am told force forehand, even if it's a lefty, it's kind of silly, but it's still going to be, this is still a forehand force, even though a lefty, their forehand would actually go to the other side of the field. It's kind of funny. All right. If you have set up a force, I'm using force forehand a lot, for a kind of an interesting reason. Maybe I'll talk about it next time. The question being basically, why do we force forehand generally instead of backhand? Not always, but like if you go out to some tournament, most teams are forcing forehand. Why is that? I'm not going to tell you right now. But if you have a force forehand, some more terminology. This is the strong side of the field, okay? And this is the weak side of the field. This terminology was, it comes up in basketball also, so I assume it's stolen from there. I don't know, but same concept, right? You have the side of the field. It's the strong side, because given the consistency of defense, that's where you expect your defenders to be. Again, thinking about eliminating threats, if there's some offensive player on the field, you would expect the defender to be biased, somewhere in this like arc, right? Arc of positioning, somewhere from here to there. That's where they're not going to be over here, right? Because that wouldn't be consistent with your mark. So that's the strong side of the field, is where you're likely to find the defenders. The weak side of the field is the kind of exposed part of the field, right? If you can get a throw through the mark onto that side of the field, easy money, right? So that's the weak side of the field. This would be breaking the force. This kind of throw would be breaking the force, breaking the mark. Is all that terminology. Another question. Wait, is there a deeper reason than backhands are easier? I never learned this. Yeah, my comment about why most teams force forehand. Yes, I do think there's a deeper reason. And the very tip of this iceberg, I think, is that, well, it's an iceberg, but I think the easiest way to say it's more complicated than just backhands are easier, forehands are harder, therefore let's force forehand. Well, once you get to a certain level, like it is easier generally for new players to learn backhands than forehands. But once you get to a certain level, people have both, right? And especially when you think about it, if the dominant mode is to force forehand, then people are getting way more practice against a forehand force, right? If I'm a new player, I come in and am playing my freshman year in college. Like, yeah, okay, my backhand will start off better. It's kind of easier. Eventually I get the hang of the forehand. Every single game I play at a tournament, more or less, people are forcing me forehand. And so by the time I'm like a senior in college, my forehand is probably better than my backhand. And so why do people force forehand at that point, right? And then if you get to, say, the club level, like there's still a forehand forcing bias. You'd think it would almost reverse. Like, okay, people spend all of college like working against the forehand force. They should be better with backhand. It doesn't like flip back. You still find a greater prevalence of forehand forcing in the club level. I think there's a deeper reason. I can talk about it next time. I mean, again, to be clear to your players, you'll find both forehand and backhand forces. Like the meta is like, it's worth it to force backhand just because people are so used to forehand, even if otherwise it'd be better to force forehand. But on average, you'll find a forehand force. Okay, I think one last terminology is that comes up later, is that when you can talk about break throws in terms, there's basically kind of two different varieties of break throw, more or less, right? So again, if you imagine this mark has this kind of force where they're cutting off this area of the field. A better mark maybe has a wider cone of defense. The worse mark would have or like worse relative to throw would have a narrower cone, but whatever. So there's two different breakthroughs, right? There's kind of the breakthrough that goes around the mark to this side, and a breakthrough that goes around the mark to this side. And this throw is called I shouldn't have said around before, but this is the around throw, right? This is the around break. And this one is the inside break. I don't really know where this terminology comes from. Like, yeah, you can imagine throwing around the mark, but either one's kind of around the mark. Maybe you have to step around the mark to get to this throw. Maybe the inside break is a reference to the fact that most of those throws you would say are being thrown at an inside out angle. I don't need to get into that terminology today, but that's another term for like the type of throw. So I don't know, but it's worth remembering like around break and inside break. And this comes up a lot, right? Especially like you're communicating in a huddle or even on the field, and and the adjustment you want to make is like, we're getting broken around a lot. We need to stop those around breaks. Then you would want to shift your mark to bias more to stop those breaks. And by the way, it's this all just gets flipped around with the other force. So if the mark was this way, then this would be the weak side of the field. This would be the strong side of the field. This would be the around break. This would be the inside break. And yeah, or you're in the timeout and, hey, we need to stop the inside breaks. Their throwers are so dominant, they keep getting these kind of zingy inside breaks to the outside of the field. Yeah, that'd be an inside break. Okay. Yeah, I'm above against an hour, so I think I'm going to stop. There's, I think, some more interesting stuff to talk about forcing, but next time, yeah, maybe I'll do a little more on forcing next time, and then we can get into some